Fellows, or a few of the alumni. Hello, everybody. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. George Rutherford, who is the Chief of the Division of Infectious Disease Epidemiology and Vice Chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at UCSF. He is trained in pediatrics and preventive medicine. His research interests are the epidemiology and prevention of infectious and tropical diseases of public health importance, both internationally and domestically, with a primary focus on HIV and AIDS. His work is funded primarily by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention through the Presidential Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the World Health Organization, and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. He also has smaller projects dealing with the epidemiology of tuberculosis in California, the prevention of childhood injury, immunizations, and bioterrorism. So welcome, looking forward to the talk.
Thank you very much. So Pal, could I have the first slide, please, or the second slide? So I'm originally from Southern California and grew up on the Mexican border, which is a very different part of the world than where almost all of you are, except for the one guy in Peru, the person in Peru. So what Paul had asked me to do is basically just to walk through my career and then really answer questions and sort of try and give some bigger picture things. So I was an undergraduate at Stanford. You can see my shirt here today. And actually went they had a master's, bachelor's degree program. So I did that as well. My undergraduate education really focused, obviously in the United States, you have to do pre-medical education as part of your undergraduate education. But I also had a very separate interest in classical studies, meaning Rome and Greece. And I had to take a lot of languages. And while that's probably not the best example of area studies, international area studies for people who are, for people who want careers in international health, there's Latin American studies, there's African studies, there's East Asian studies, there's South Asian studies, and on and on. And but it is area studies, and you learn culture, you learn language, you learn history, you learn all those things that you have to know as well as the biology. So I think it's kind of a good thing to pay attention to. I went to medical school at Duke University in North Carolina, which is a very has a very sort of odd medical training program where you basically go to medical school for 2 years, then take 2 years of electives. I did all my electives in infectious diseases and microbiology. So I was really sort of pointed towards infectious diseases at a fairly early age. I did a residency, a registrarship to translate for people in the British system, in pediatrics at the University of California in San Diego, and at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. While I was a chief resident, a fourth-year resident, pediatrics in the United States is a 3-year residency. 1 or 2 people every year are asked to continue for an additional year to be in charge of the other residents, and that's called a chief resident. And during my 4th-year chief residency in San Diego, I attended at the Hospital Infantil in Tijuana, Mexico, which is just across the border from San Diego, and seeing a variety of sort of exotic, what other people would consider exotic infectious diseases, but we would consider sort of run-of-the-mill sick care. I also, in those days, the chief residents were expected to really be, as well as organizing the other residents, were expected to be intensive care fellows. So I had basically a full year of intensive care. So I'm perfectly happy when somebody gets very sick on an airplane. I know exactly what to do. That state-of-the-art 1982 knowledge. But, it doesn't change. Physiology doesn't change very much. So I think the lesson to learn from this stuff is that good foundations are good foundations. I'm not going to say that you have to go to medical school, but if you have gone to medical school or in medical school, it certainly doesn't hurt anything. And in fact, I think gives you a very good basic understanding of what's happening in international health. If you haven't gone to medical school, well, that's fine too. But try and get as broad a feel for the discipline as possible. Can I get the next one, please? So I did a fellowship at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. In the first year of my, and this is the Epidemic Intelligence Service, or EIS, as some people may know it. This is Dr. Klausner was an EIS officer as well. This is a fellowship program that takes probably about 60 people every year for a 2-year fellowship. And it's really an applied field epidemiology. And basically you investigate outbreaks and do a bunch of other stuff. But the real kind of thrust of it is outbreaks. I spent my first year in Atlanta in the Division of Viral Diseases at CDC with a focus on childhood syndromes of unknown etiology, like Reye's syndrome and Kawasaki syndrome, and at that point in time, hemolytic uremic syndrome, but also on other viral diseases. And I have here a little clipping from my first big outbreak, which was a polio outbreak in Taiwan in the summer of 1982. And that was kind of my first big exposure I'd seen clinical polio before in patients from Mexico when I was in San Diego. But, now I've all of a sudden saw 2,000 cases of paralytic polio. So I sort of knew a ton about polio at that point in time. I also spent the second year of my EIS fellowship at the New York City Department of Health with a focus on immunizations and on tropical medicine. There was a small tropical medicine clinical service at the New York City Department of Health that basically had 3 clinics. One was in Brooklyn, which focused predominantly on immigrants from the Arabian Peninsula, predominantly Yemenis, who had schistosomiasis, chronic schistosomiasis. Another was in Upper Manhattan, and that focused right next to the Columbia Medical School, and that focused largely on intestinal parasites and was used heavily by people from the Dominican Republic as they arrived in New York. And then the third clinic, which really sort of charted my future course, was in Chelsea, a part of Manhattan that's just north of Greenwich Village, and it was a clinic that was used predominantly by gay men with amoebiasis and giardiasis, and I would attend there. And this was in 1983, and would see patients with fever, night sweats, generalized lymphadenopathy, weight loss, who would want to know if they had giardia with no diarrhea, right? And so they were basically had HIV infection. There was no HIV test at that point in time, so it was a syndromic diagnosis. And I ended up, despite being a pediatrician, I ended up diagnosing, a number of patients there with AIDS. I had overseas assignments, as I said, in Taiwan, but also in Mozambique for famine. And I did a year after EIS at New York City, stayed at New York City, and had early involvement with HIV. This other little clip I put in here about wound botulism in drug users was a CDC investigation of a cluster of wound botulism, which was fascinating because there's also an entity of wound diphtheria, and you give different antisera for wound botulism versus wound diphtheria. And it turns out that in New York City, they use the same retired police horses to raise immune globulin, both for botulism and diphtheria. And so they put botulism on one bottle, on the label of one bottle, and diphtheria on the label of another bottle. But it was all basically the same stuff. So you didn't have to make the differential diagnosis. So I always thought that was a kind of a cool little bit of side knowledge. Next one, please. So on Valentine's Day, 1985, there was an announcement made that a test for HIV had become available. So this was in February. Also at that time, the then U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler, claimed that the U.S. had figured out what had caused HIV, which was, of course, completely false. It had been figured out a year before at the Institut Pasteur in Paris, but she made this rather outlandish claim. Anyway, the Nobel Committee got it right at the end. So all of a sudden, with a biological test for HIV, things were kind of off and running in the world of HIV. And CDC sent me to the San Francisco Department of Public Health in 1985 to be the principal investigator of a series of CDC-sponsored studies, and including one very large cohort study looking at the natural history of HIV, and to run the AIDS surveillance programs for San Francisco. As part of that, I founded the AIDS office in 1986 as one of the sort of the first in the world to be a specific entity within the Department of Public Health. And it had an internal structure that went with it that sort of corresponded to who dealt with CDC on surveillance, who dealt with CDC on research, who dealt with CDC on prevention, and who dealt with the Health Resources and Services Administration on continuum of care and care provision. And I was gratified to see many years later that the Brazilian national program had the same internal organization, because a number of Brazilian fellows had passed through our offices. And I think that was sort of punctuated by the International AIDS Conference, which was held in San Francisco in 1990. And for those of you who want to come to San Francisco, it's going to be held here again in 2020. The conference this summer is in Amsterdam, but 2 years afterwards, we'll be back in San Francisco. I was recruited to, and down here, this little clip, which is a course of HIV infection and a cohort of homosexual and bisexual men in an 11-year follow-up study. This was the big cohort study that we ran. It involved 6,700 patients from the San Francisco Municipal STD Clinic, and who are all gay men. We've been part of a hepatitis B vaccine trial, so they had to screen through, almost 7,000 men to find enough who are hepatitis B antibody negative, surface core antibody negative, to be part of a vaccine trial. So we had all these banked bloods, and we're able to go back and determine, by testing the bloods, determine who became infected when with HIV, and then follow them forward. And that's where the numbers came from that said things like 50% of people with HIV infection will develop AIDS within 10 years of infection. That was a direct observation from this study, and it fed a lot of the modeling efforts around the burden of HIV in places before antiretroviral drugs became available. It's now of largely historic interest because antiretrovirals have completely changed the natural history. I was recruited to the State Department of Public Health, Department of Health Services in 1990 as the chief of the infectious disease branch and the state epidemiologist, which is a very cool job because you saw all the infectious diseases across California. California is a big state with about 35 million people in it, with lots of different ecosystems, lots of different kind of urban-rural interface issues. One of the more interesting things about that job was I was not only responsible for communicable disease control in humans, but also in domestic animals. And to a certain extent, in wild animals. So we got into things like a distemper outbreak of sea lions in San Francisco Bay, and anthrax in cattle, and all sorts of kind of stuff that you would not normally get involved with in the world of infectious disease practice. I became the state health officer, the chief of public health for the state, in 1993, with a focus largely on chronic disease prevention, with a heavy focus on smoking or anti-smoking, breast cancer screening, breast cancer treatment, environmental health, and other things, right? And what it really provided me with was a very large overview of communicable disease control practice at a state level, which was basically corresponds to most countries, the size of most countries, and and then state level public health practice, where you're dealing with the legislature. In the United States, most public health law is state law, not federal law, and so there was a constant stream of proposed legislation that was being put forward by a variety of special interest groups or by the public health community to try and shore up public health law in California. And I think it was a really great experience. And so for those of us who are in academia, it sounds sort of, like not like a career-ending move to go work for government. It is far from that. And it is endlessly interesting and endlessly broadening. And it makes you a much better academic, because having walked in people's shoes whom you're now trying to work with in health departments, it gives a much better understanding of what they need to know in order to function. Okay, the next one, please. In 1995, I'm at this point in time 43 years old, so you can do the math here. I left the state health department, and this corresponded with an end of a governor's term, and became a professor and associate dean at the School of Public Health in Berkeley for a couple of years, which was interesting. I thought it would be so engaged and such a natural transition, but it turns out that the School of Public Health was in one orbit, and the state public health effort, enterprise, was in a completely separate orbit, and they really didn't overlap at all. So I came to UCSF full-time, to the medical school full-time in 1997 with a couple of missions. One was to become the director of the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies international programs, and this is a program that's now been running for for almost 30 years. I attached a poster from one of the international AIDS conferences on this page as well, so you can kind of get a feel for what we do. But basically, it focuses on a progression of short-term training in clinical research, how to design studies, moving through into how to field studies, data analysis, manuscript writing, and then for some people, a progression to a doctoral degree in epidemiology. There have been a handful of people who have done this and quite successfully, and have gone on to both academic as well as practice careers. I also had a research portfolio that was a mix of domestic and international things. Domestically, I worked on some of the things I'd been interested in from when I was at the state health department, an endemic fungal disease in the southwest of the United States and also in northwestern Mexico and parts of South America, called coccidioidomycosis. Also a large chlamydia outbreak and syphilis elimination. And then also internationally, I became an editor for the Cochrane collaboration. I was the HIV/AIDS editor for Cochrane and remain an editor for the infectious disease group today. I don't know if you've used the Cochrane collaboration. It's well worthwhile to look at. This is basically a group that has taken on the task of doing meta-analyses of all interventions, not prognostic stuff, interventions in medicine and public health, in public health and curative medicine, including prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation. So we were able to build the Cochrane group, HIV group, over time, and ended up with 50 to 60 to 70, I guess now, systematic reviews on a whole variety of topics. And it's great one-stop shopping. The reviews also are supposed to be updated every couple of years, so they're meant to be current. And then finally, there had been an Institute for Global Health set up at UCSF in 1999 when Professor Richard Feacham had come to UCSF from the World Bank. He'd been the former dean of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So he'd come and set up an Institute for Global Health. It was kind of geographically right next to where my group was. And he went to Geneva to become the first executive director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. And at that point, I became the director of the Institute for Global Health, with sort of much broader oversight, not only of the HIV portfolio, but also of Professor Feacham's very large malaria portfolio. The next one, please, pal. So coincident with that, PEPFAR arrived. And PEPFAR, the Presidential Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, was announced in the State of the Union address by President Bush in 2002. And so that became a major funder of my group in the Institute for Global Health, which is focused heavily on data. And it's now called, our group's now called Global Strategic Information, kind of conform with CDC parlance. And we work in a large number of countries, probably 25 different countries, with a focus on HIV prevention, and then on monitoring and evaluation and surveillance. I've had a heavy hand over the years, partially because of Cochrane and partially because of these activities with WHO guidelines writing. And I was a major contributor to a series of all the antiretroviral treatment guidelines as we moved forward to treat all. And more recently, have put together the manual for WHO on cascade analysis. And for those of you who are not in HIV, the big thing in HIV is understanding how in this era of trying to treat everybody, we want to make sure that 90% of people are diagnosed, 90% of those who are diagnosed are on treatment, and 90% of those who are on treatment are suppressed, have viral suppression at a level of less than 1,000 copies per mil. So that's the 90-90-90. That becomes a kind of a cascade, if you like, a sort of step down histogram when you draw it out. So this is a big program. This is millions of dollars a year, a staff of maybe 100 people, permanent offices in 5 countries in Africa. And we also have major collaborating groups that work with us in Eastern Europe. I've also tried to retain some of my public health focus. I chair the TB Elimination Advisory Committee for the California Department of Public Health. And we're currently working on a public health observatory for California that will combine data, state data, and University of California data, to make a kind of a one-stop shop for data analysis around health. I also direct the residency program in general preventive medicine and public health. But in Britain, this would be called community health. But this is teaching physicians how to be essentially county health officers in California. I have a major teaching role in the Institute for Global Health Sciences, which is the kind of the successor to the Institute for Global Health, and in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And like all academics who are in the wrong place at the wrong time, I have major administrative roles in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. I'm the vice chair and the head of the Division of Infectious Disease Epidemiology, which has 27 faculty members in it, which is by far the largest group in that department. The next one, please. Okay, so on to lessons. So I think the first lesson should be around mentorship. And I was exceptionally fortunate to have the right mentors at the right time. And I think my my point here is that having the right mentor is hugely important. And the right time to have the right mentor is during your postdoctoral fellowship, although it can happen really at any time. One of these pictures is of my, for those of you who are not aware, in the United States, there's this crazy conflation between semi-professional athletics and higher education, so that every university judges its worth on its athletic prowess, which really doesn't exist, sort of exists in Australia, but not really anyplace else. And this was my college coach, I played tennis in college. And we won 2 national championships. He was a very intense guy, but a very nice guy. And what he taught me, I think, was that, personal relationships are hugely important. And he managed people as temperamental. Some of the other people had gone to school after I did at Stanford, like John McEnroe. Trying to keep that guy under control was like a full-time job. But, he managed to do it, and he got the best out of people. And he got the best out of people by knowing when to be kind of tough and when to be supportive. And he was supportive most of the time. I think another thing is that you should become mentors, right? Being a mentor is hugely helpful for you. So as you start to get into your academic careers, you should go out of your way to mentor a newcomer, especially in academia, but also in business and government. Have somebody you're training, somebody that to whom you're going to impart wisdom. So Sherry Weiser, who's a faculty member here, who I believe has spoken to you before, says, leave a trail of breadcrumbs, right? You want to, like Hansel and Gretel, you want to be able to have someone benefit from the knowledge you've accrued in your career. This other picture is a guy, for those of you who, for Americans on the line, you may recognize Edward Koch, who was the mayor of New York in the 1980s. But the guy standing next to him is David Sensor, who was one of my greatest mentors, probably my greatest mentor in public health, who was the New York City health commissioner during the Koch era. And Dr. Sensor had also previously been the director of CDC. So he was connected and knew everybody and knew everything, and had a very broad overview of public health and the importance of public health and mental health. I think the other thing besides mentorship, which implies a kind of a vertical relationship, is to think horizontally. Look for collaborators and friends outside your institution, outside your department, outside of your field. There are remarkable connections to be made, and as long as you remain insular and sort of don't go out and go to other lectures and sort of try and learn what there is to be learned, you're going to be just that. You're going to remain insular. Whereas I think thinking broadly, interacting broadly with people makes a huge difference. The next one, please, Pal. So the first thing, and this is not really directed for anybody but Noah, is don't be too parochial in your education. Go out and work in other places, in other institutions, see the world. Spend time overseas, immerse yourself in new cultures. If you don't know another major language, learn one. If you know another language, learn another, and maintain your proficiency. In our office in California, where essentially everybody speaks English and Spanish, we don't care that they speak Spanish. What we want are people who can speak French, can speak Swahili, can speak Hindi, can speak Mandarin, can speak Portuguese. Those are the major, and Russian, and those are the major languages that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So having proficiency in those languages is hugely important. The other thing I'd say is, now that for those of you who are in your postdoc years, become an expert in something, and a real expert in something that's very narrow, and stay on the cutting edge of that field. So I think it was Lynette who was in mental health. I may have the names and fields wrong because I didn't write them down. Try and so mental global health is a very underrepresented field. So you're kind of the world's expert almost at the start of the day, but try and find something in which you can be really expert, like PTSD in refugees, or community lay psychotherapy for whatever disorder, for affective disorders. Something good, right? But be narrow and stay on the cutting edge of that field. You should be open to new ideas. And this is the great part of your postdoctoral fellowship. While you're narrowing, you're also experiencing new things. Pay attention to those. Great sources of new ideas are your students, your residents, your fellows, and your other junior faculty members. I think that's an important thing, is really to stay open to new ideas. And then, I know you're not going to like to hear this, but if you're going to stay in academia, you're going to end up having to do administration. So learn how to be a good administrator. It's going to be part of your life. So just embrace it and don't avoid it. Okay? Take some classes, understand how budgets work, understand how the hateful, dreaded personnel system works, understand about space, understand the processes of your institutions, right? And remember that the best business calls are personal. So when you call somebody up, it's much better. The calls go much more easily if you already have a relationship with them. So when you have the opportunity to deal with people from your funding agencies, from colleagues from other institutions, try and really get on personal terms with them. Be friendly with them. Send them follow-up notes. Make the connection and keep it. And then the final thing was that, since I seem to be going to be working till the end of time, to enjoy your retirements and make sure you plan for them carefully. And just the final one, please. I was trying to, the last slide, please, pal. I was just trying to think of what the most important lesson is. I think the most important lesson is to be happy at your work. And Robert Frost wrote this. This was a long poem, and this is the last stanza of the poem, written in the 1930s. But yield who will to their separation, my object in living is to unite my avocation and my vocation. As my two eyes make it one in sight, only where love and need are one, and the work is play for mortal stakes, is the deed ever really done for heaven and for the future's sakes. So uniting your avocation, what you like to do, with your vocation, which is what you do, is hugely important. And, I, for one, am happy to go to work every day and deal with the issues of the day, the opportunities, the challenges. It's just endlessly rewarding for me and very enjoyable. So with that, I'll stop, and happy to answer questions. Paul, I think, is going to do the moderation of this, right?
Yes. If anyone has questions that they don't want to say out loud, you can ask it on the chat. But if you're comfortable unmuting yourself and asking the question, please go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. This is Noah.
Yo.
Thank you for the great talk. I was wondering, speaking that you have this quote up on happiness, when in your career were you the most happy? And are there any parts of your career now that you wish you could shed and do other things with?
No, not really. I mean, I think I was happy. I think I was probably the happiest. Well, I think I'm the happiest right now. I've always liked what I've done, and being the kind of the broader the issues you deal with, the more interesting it is for me. So I love being the state epidemiologist for California, and I'd come home, and my wife is also a physician and ran the emergency department at a large children's hospital near where we live. And we'd come home and talk at dinner, and my children all thought I was a veterinarian because I only talked about animal stuff because it was so new to me and so different. And the veterinarians could always put you in your place, when you say, well, and they'd be talking about some disease that caused gastrointestinal disease in cows. And I'd say, so, when you examine them, what did the stomach feel like? And they'd say, which stomach, So you always knew that they knew one thing more than you did. But it was endlessly interesting. You're not going to like this. The thing you can't avoid internship and residency. No, I hate to tell you. So just embrace it and learn as much as you can. I mean, that's why you're doing it, is to learn broadly. In pediatrics, they had this ridiculous training program where they kept us in neonatal intensive care units, probably for the third of the entire residency. So, you know, I'm like really expert in how to take care of sick newborn babies. But since nobody lets you do that unless you're a fellow, and you know, unless you've already been board certified in neonatology, it's sort of wasted time in a lot of ways. But anyway, that's just the way it was.
Great, thank you.
Don't think you can weasel out of residency, though.
It's Sis Tariro.
Hi, Tariro.
I just wanted to say thank you for emphasizing the importance of the administrative role. For people like myself, I'm constantly running away from any type of administrative role, and if I can give someone else to do the work, I always tend to give someone else to do the work. So your talk just helped me to realize that it's a necessary evil, if I can put it that way. And I think as a researcher that's growing and developing and trying to establish myself, I think it's just something that I have to take the bull by the horns and just do. So thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's administration and there's administration. And in academics, you're at Kemry, is that right, Tariro? Did I hear that right?
I beg your pardon?
Where are you at Kemry? Where? I'm sorry.
I'm at the University of Zimbabwe.
I'm sorry. I'm getting people mixed up here.
No, it's okay.
University's got to be careful, right? Because all of a sudden you'll find yourself on the committee on committees. You know, if you're not careful, there's certain things that should be avoided. And I would also say that early on in your career, what we advise people, we want them to be responsible for their own worlds. You know, for the budgets, for the accounting, for understanding how funds flow, for human resources, for equipment, for that sort of things. What I advise people not to get enmeshed in are things like the institutional review boards, the admissions committees for the medical schools. Those things are hugely time consuming. And as junior faculty, I view people's roles as writing grants and getting papers published. As they get older and more established in their careers, that's when I think that's sort of fine to go out and do those kinds of bigger things. But to avoid those sort of huge service component activities early on in your career, I think is an important thing as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Hi, my name is Lynette from Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you so much for your message about trying to focus in some area in research so that the best maybe in PTSD or a particular field. But I wanted to find out if you ever do any clinical practice, do you miss it? And how do you maintain some sort of balance? Right now, I'm struggling to see how I can balance my research career with still clinical practice so that I don't forget, whatever I learned as a psychiatrist, the clinical practice.
Right.
What's your advice around that?
Well, so personally, I view the practice of public health as clinical practice. And so that's why I keep my hand in the state health department and try and help them make important public health decisions. Clinically, I don't really do anything anymore. As I say, my clinical practice is limited to United Airlines. When they call them, it goes ding, ding, ding. Is there a doctor on the airplane and you're over at Greenwood? You're going to have to get up and try and do something. The other thing I'd say, but I think I would say you should set aside probably something like 20% time for clinical. And I realize psychiatry is probably a somewhat difficult field for that because it's long. You have sequential visits from patients over a long period of time. there might be something like a psychiatric consult service you could be on for a couple of months a year. So you keep your hand in it, you know, an inpatient consult service or something like that. But I think it's important to maintain clinical proficiency. And I would say 20% is probably not an unreasonable amount of time. If you start to move up to 40 to 60%, then you're not going to be able to get away for your research, especially if it's not being done very close by where you are.
True. That's very true. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your advice.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Danger from South Africa. I'm working on malaria. Thank you for your great talk. I'm just going back to the administrative, how to combine administrative and research. Based on my experience or based on what I've been seeing around me, I've seen so many professors who are publishing greatly, and the moment they take up an administrative position, then their research output drops. So many, I mean, they hardly publish a paper in a year. So I'm just wondering, how can you really combine these?
Yeah.
Is it really possible, or you just have to drop one for the other one?
So in the senior administrative positions come at a cost. And by that, I mean like department chair, being a dean, being a provost, those kinds of positions. They come at a cost, and they come at a cost of your research productivity. What I was saying was that you're going to end up having to understand administrative processes anyway. So as you're a postdoc, try and learn as much as you can about the administrative sorts of things that you're going to have to deal with for the rest of your career. I think as you start to get older, and you are less interested in chasing money around and trying to write grants all the time, that administrative positions that pay your salary start to look more attractive. And that's typically what we see, is that people who are doing administration are in their 50s to 60s. And I don't think that's inappropriate. You know, we're not in the business of making money. These aren't startup companies where we're figuring out the next great app, and, you know, the average age of the workforce is, 14. So youth is not a prerequisite for good administration and medicine, in academic medicine and academic public health. It's probably just the opposite. So I think as in your younger years, you should concentrate on your research careers, but take the opportunity to learn administrative processes. As you age, if you really enjoy it, then that's something you can age into.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi, George. I have some questions from Dr. Klausner, and I was hoping I could ask them. So one of them is, how and what are some successful ways international scientists and non-US scientists get funded?
Well, the principal way is through collaboration with scientists from high-income countries. So a lot of you may have had experience collaborating with U.S. investigators. There are also the British government through the Medical Research Council has very similar kinds of programs, although much smaller, as do the French and Spanish governments. So I think that that's one way. There's actually something to be put very much in your minds, is an NIH program called the K as in King, 43 awards, which are mid-career awards for international scientists. And I think those are, that's something to be aware of. My third call this morning is to review applications for K43s with NIH. And I can tell you the quality of the applications is not that great. And it's the sort of things that you guys, having done this fellowship, will be in a much better position to apply for. You probably apply for them 5 years from now, but I just want to put that in your mind as well. The other thing is that there are some countries, especially the Latin American countries, have national research programs with funding available. So I know Mexico, Peru, and Brazil all do. I think South Africa does, although I could be wrong. I think India does as well. So some countries have their own research funds that they'll make available to their own investigators to investigate problems within their own countries. The other thing to be aware of are the development agencies, especially the European development agencies. So who will, and you can always do sort of program projects where you're trying to implement and use implementation science, a proven public health intervention in a new country, and that's the sort of stuff that the British Department for International Development, the German Development Agency, which is called GTZ, or I guess it's GIZ now, something. They've changed their name. And there are a whole bunch of those, and actually the EU has some funding through those as well. Have some capacity to pay for funding. For those of you who live in predominantly Muslim countries, the Aga Khan Foundation has money for research and for training. For those of you who are, I don't know, in the African Union countries, I really would look to see what you might be able to do with working with your local PEPFAR offices, if there are PEPFAR programs in your countries. And there's a real kind of move afoot in PEPFAR to contract with local entities as much as possible and cut out people like me from the equation. So you may well be well positioned, or your institutions may be well positioned for those sorts of things. Kemry, for instance, has a huge PEPFAR portfolio. So those are some thoughts about that.
Thank you. And based on that, what's your advice on the most effective ways for non-US scientists to maintain a research program out of the US?
Again, I think it's predominantly through collaboration. Just to mention a name at the University of Zimbabwe, James Hakim, who's I think the chair of medicine, isn't that? I think that's right, has been hugely influential in HIV and has done a lot of very formative work. And he's a very nice guy on top of everything else. He's funded along with U.S. collaborators through U.S. sources, along with British collaborators through British sources. He gets occasional money from sort of larger international organizations, but he's an example of somebody who's really built a long-term strategic series of long-term strategic partnerships that have been able to funnel monies from other countries to his research program. So I think that, again, I'll come back to the first thing I said, which is partnerships. Okay, if you live in Brazil, if you live in Peru, if you live in Mexico, there's some other ways of doing this. But since only one of you is calling in from Peru, I think that really, if we're talking about Africa, we're talking about partnerships.
Thank you, George. And how do you think non-US scientists can create and maintain these successful collaborations with US scientists?
Well, there are these things, talking about NIH grants, there are these things called K99R00 grants. K99R00, which when you write it out in the vernacular, we call them kangaroo grants because it looks like kangaroo when you write them out. So it's there are K awards or training awards. So you can do a couple of years of training at a U.S. institution with a major collaborator, and then it segues into a 3 research years, which is the R00 program. And foreign investigators are eligible to apply for those. So it's something that you could do, like you could get a second postdoctoral fellowship with someone that could be supported by one of these awards, get some additional training to shore up where you might have some holes in your training, and then write the R00 part of it, the actual research program. And then you become an real honest to God NIH investigator. And you could take that back to your country and along with 1 million collaborations that you've been able to set up when you've been in the US for a couple of years, and then run with that as part of your research career. So I think these K99 R00s are a good thing. I also think the K43s are a good thing. Again, more for mid-career people than for starters. But there are these mechanisms that will help non-US investigators and I'm not talking about from Canada here, I mean non-US investigators from low and middle income countries to give them access to US research funds. I'm not sure if there's a similar program in Britain. The Wellcome Trust might have something like that, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. And my final question is, how do non-US scientists obtain positions at US institutions?
By applying to them, first and foremost. If you don't apply, nobody's going to start having the conversations. There are a bunch of visa issues that enter into this. I think it's much easier if you do a fellowship at these institutions and try and stay on. We have a woman who's a postdoc with us now, who's from an African country, who is getting a K99 R00 award. And we're in the midst of putting her on the faculty. But she was here as a fellow, right? And then she can make a transition with an H-1B visa or a J-1 visa or something like that into a faculty position. And then we'll be in a position to either stay here or go back to her home institution over time. It's one thing, probably the easiest way to do this is to stay in the U.S., have access to all the U.S. funds, and then do your research portfolio back in your home country. Now, I don't know that really builds capacity locally in African countries or low and middle income countries. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of bigger on people going back to their institutions and trying to do their research programs at the institutions. Mm-hmm. There's this program that the Fogarty Institute at NIH has. Fogarty is kind of like the Center for International Health at NIH, calls MEPIs, Medical Education something, MEPI, M like Mike, EPI. And those partner a U.S. institution with I think it's all African institutions, with another African institution for purposes of faculty training, curriculum development, research capacity, those kinds of things.
Thank you.
And we ended 4 seconds early.
We did. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Rutherford, for presenting. It was a great presentation, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.